Tullahoma, Tennessee, might not be the first place you'd think of when you hear about a murder. Yet, in the early morning hours of July 2nd, 2012, a shocking scene unfolded. Around 1:30 a.m., investigators stumbled upon a fire on the side of a secluded road. What they initially thought was a simple blaze turned out to be something far more horrifying: the burning body of a young woman. As soon as the fire was put out, the clues started to add up. They found a woman with star tattoos behind her ears, wearing what remained of a nursing school shirt. She appeared to be in her 20s and was found without clothes from the waist down. The fire had intensely burned her pelvic area, hinting at a sinister act of violence. Megan Sharpton was born on October 24, 1987, in the small American city of Tullahoma, in the state of Tennessee. She grew up in a large and friendly family with 2 sisters and a brother, with whom she got along very well. Her parents strove to give maximum attention to all their children, but Megan was especially close to her mother. From an early age, she helped her parents care for her younger siblings and was always eager to assist friends and family. During high school, Megan decided she wanted to become a nurse, which led her to enroll at Motlow Community College, located about 7 miles from her home. She also worked as a waitress at a local restaurant and eventually moved in with her boyfriend. In the summer of 2012, at the age of 24 and just a few months shy of finishing college, Megan planned to immediately find a job as a nurse. Shortly before her disappearance, she had also started working at a nursing home to gain practical skills in caring for the elderly. Despite her busy life, Megan tried to see her family whenever she could. On July 1st, her sister, who lived in another city, came home, and Megan promised to meet with her. However, that evening, Megan called her mother to say she would be delayed. She had been offered an interesting job opportunity and had arranged an interview for that night. She was excited about this opportunity and promised her mother that she would visit her as soon as the interview was over. According to her, the job involved taking care of an elderly woman. As time passed, there was no word from Megan. She did not respond to messages or calls. Her parents began to worry. They contacted her boyfriend, but he also did not know where Megan was and was unaware of any interview. Despite this, the parents decided not to panic and waited for their daughter to get in touch. At 24, with her schedule packed between her studies and 2 jobs, it was possible she was just busy, but Megan did not show up the next day. Meanwhile, in a remote area several kilometers from the city, around 1:30 a.m., a group of teenagers saw a fire in a field. Given the very hot summer, they thought wildfires might have spread to the grass. They immediately called the firefighters, who arrived at the scene to find an unexpected turn of events. Shortly after beginning to extinguish the flames, they discovered a body at the center of the fire. Once the fire was fully extinguished and the police arrived, they realized they were looking at a dead girl. It was clear that a murder had taken place. However, detectives could not establish the victim's identity immediately, as she had no documents, wallet, or phone with her. Due to the effects of the fire, the features were unrecognizable. The only clues available to detectives were 2 small star-shaped tattoos. The investigation at the crime scene led to the conclusion that the girl was dead before the fire started. The victim suffered a serious head injury that appeared to be fatal. Yet, no clues pointing to the presence of the killer were found. The victim was partially dressed, and from her shirt, the police deduced that the girl might have been a nurse. They also found that there were no missing person reports matching her description, which complicated the identification process. However, news quickly spread throughout the small town. Megan's mother saw a social media post about a young woman found dead in a field with 2 star-shaped tattoos and realized with horror that it was her daughter. Medical examiners eventually confirmed that the deceased was indeed Megan Sharpton. They determined that the cause of death was a bullet wound to the back of the head, supporting the police's theory that she was already dead at the time of the fire. Furthermore, she was killed elsewhere and her body was then moved to the field. She had also been subjected to violence prior to her death, and the experts were able to extract a DNA sample of the criminal. The DNA was immediately checked against the national database, but there were no matches. The detectives began by searching for Megan's car, a red Mustang. She had worked at a restaurant that night and had left in her vehicle. The car was nowhere to be found, indicating that the killer might have taken it somewhere that could yield crucial evidence. While its location remained unknown, the police began to look for potential suspects among Megan's acquaintances. Attention turned to her boyfriend, who became a significant person of interest. Megan's sister immediately expressed her suspicion to the detectives that he was involved in the murder, pointing out that the couple had been having relationship issues. Megan had been with him for 3 years, part of which they spent living together in an apartment they shared with another roommate, but he denied any involvement in the incident. Initially, he claimed that everything was fine between him and Megan, but eventually conceded that their relationship was troubled and heading towards a split. However, he insisted he had no motive for murder and provided an alibi for the time of her death. While the police were verifying his alibi, they decided to search the apartment where Megan and her boyfriend lived. In the bathroom, they found troubling evidence, traces of blood and syringes containing illicit substances. At the same time, 12 miles from the city, police found Megan's abandoned car in a secluded and remote area. There were no documents or phone inside, which meant the perpetrator could have taken or discarded them elsewhere. The police appealed to the public, asking anyone who found such items to contact them immediately. There were no signs of blood or a struggle in the car, but there was an intriguing clue, a note with a non-existent address. Investigators concluded that the unknown assailant had tried to lure Megan to a secluded place to commit the crime. Early in the investigation, they discovered that Megan was preparing for a job interview. However, they had no leads in that direction. One theory was that the person who offered her the job had given her a fake address. When the community learned of the details surrounding the case, a chilling connection was made. 6 months earlier, hundreds of miles from Tullahoma, another young woman of a similar age to Megan had disappeared without a trace. She was also a pharmacy student, which led many to fear that there could be a serial killer in the county. This only heightened the community's anxiety, with concerns that the criminal might strike again. Meanwhile, the police questioned the roommate of Megan and her boyfriend, who admitted to using illicit substances. He claimed that Megan and her boyfriend were unaware of this and that they never partook themselves. Forensic experts analyzed the blood traces found and concluded that they indeed belonged to the roommate. However, the story did not end there. He revealed that Megan and her boyfriend's relationship had in fact ended some time ago, and he himself had recently started a relationship with Megan. He had kept his addiction hidden from her. Knowing this, the police began to suspect both her boyfriend and the roommate. The boyfriend might have harbored resentment towards Megan, and the roommate had a known drug habit, but there was no direct evidence against either of them. During questioning, he claimed he was unaware of the new relationship, and by this time, the police had already verified his alibi. He had been at work at the time of Megan's murder, which excluded him from the list of suspects. As for the roommate, he did not have a solid alibi. However, an analysis of his phone showed that he had been trying to reach Megan throughout the night and had sent her messages trying to find out where she was. Although this was not conclusive proof of his innocence, the police doubted he was the murderer. DNA samples were taken from both men and sent to the lab for analysis, but the results could take months. In the meantime, the detectives found a new lead. In the last interrogation, Megan's boyfriend mentioned he might help the investigation. On the day of Megan's disappearance, an unknown man had called her old phone, which was at home, wanting to speak to her about a job as a caregiver, saying that she had been recommended by someone named Naomi. He mentioned that Megan had spoken several times of a fellow student with that name, but he knew no further details. Police began searching among the students at Motlow College and soon found a student by that name. When detectives obtained her address, Naomi was not at home. Neighbors provided Naomi's phone number to the police. Naomi was surprised by the police call and claimed she barely knew Megan, having only met her in a few classes and never speaking much. Naomi insisted that she had not recommended Megan for any job and that Megan had bothered her, so she certainly wouldn't have helped her. The police were disappointed that this promising lead didn't yield further information, but they still had more substantial evidence to consider. Investigators handed over the phone, which had received the call about the job, and they had the caller's number in their possession. Experts determined that the call was made from a prepaid phone, making it impossible to establish the owner's name. However, the police traced the device back to the store where it was sold, which had a surveillance camera facing the checkout counter. Upon reviewing the footage from the day the phone was purchased, they immediately identified the buyer. From these images, the police inferred that the individual was purchasing the phone for some illicit purpose. Prepaid phones are popular among those involved in criminal activities in the United States because they do not require personal information for activation, and this person, seen taking out his own phone from his pocket at some point, indicated he was buying an additional phone for suspect purposes. There was also a camera pointing at the parking lot in the store. The police saw the buyer exit the building and get into his car, which soon led to establishing his identity. It turned out to be Timothy Gifford, who had an impressive criminal history. However, his activities were limited to minor drug dealings and he had not been implicated in serious offenses. They soon tracked him down and brought him into the station. He said he bought the phone not for himself but for a 37-year-old acquaintance named Donnie Jones, who was recuperating from surgery and couldn't pick up the phone himself. In exchange for this favor, Donnie gave Timothy some illegal pills. The detectives were familiar with Donnie, who also had an impressive criminal history, but often acted as an informant for the police. Despite this, no connection between Donnie and Megan was found until Timothy revealed something else. Donnie wanted to trade his van for a Mustang and asked for help with the exchange. Timothy found this request odd since Donnie had 2 young children, and the Mustang isn't exactly known as a family car. Nevertheless, he agreed to try to find a buyer. Donnie handed over the van, and Timothy noticed that inside the old vehicle, there were brand new carpets and seat covers. Donnie explained that his wife told him that the chance of selling the car was much higher with a renovated interior, and here is where the police suddenly discovered something that excited them and connected all the parts of the story. Donnie turned out to be the husband of Naomi, the same woman who supposedly recommended Megan for the job. At that point, the detectives realized they were getting closer to a solution. Unfortunately for them, the man's DNA was not in the database because he had not been convicted of violent crimes. They immediately went to Donnie and Naomi's house to talk to them. At first, the man said he did not know Megan, but after a few minutes he mentioned that he had driven her and Naomi to college several times. This seemed odd compared to Naomi's statements a week earlier. At that time, she claimed that she barely knew Megan and that they hardly spoke and did not get along in general. However, During a second conversation, the woman finally admitted that her husband indeed had driven Megan occasionally. However, Donnie firmly insisted on his innocence. According to him, on the night of the murder, he was at home with his children, allowed the police to search his home without a warrant, and voluntarily provided a DNA sample. He also denied having asked Timothy to buy a prepaid phone for him. In the house, the police found no clues and could only wait for the DNA test results, which could also take months. By then, 2 months had passed since the murder. Megan's parents received her nursing diploma posthumously. People hoped the police would capture the heartless monster as soon as possible, someone who could kill again at any moment. Finally, the laboratory results showed a complete match between Donnie's DNA and the sample found on Megan's body. He was immediately taken to the station, but he continued to insist on his innocence. Upon learning about the DNA match, he changed his story and told detectives that he and Megan had a secret relationship that he had hidden from his wife. According to him, that was why he hadn't mentioned it before. The police considered his story to be obviously fabricated, but they had to release him since there was no concrete evidence other than the DNA, and it was impossible to find 100% proof that would refute Donnie's words. Thus, the detectives were almost certain that the man was the killer, but they needed more evidence. Although they couldn't charge him with murder, they managed to detain him. During a search of his car, they found a firearm he was not allowed to possess due to his criminal record. While in custody, the police had time to look for more evidence. They didn't have to worry about Donnie attacking someone else or escaping. Soon, experts determined that Megan was shot with a weapon of the same caliber as Donnie's rifle. The detectives obtained a warrant to track his phone and check his movements on the night of Megan's murder. They compared those data with the movements of a prepaid phone that Donnie supposedly never owned. Here, the police had a significant breakthrough. The prepaid phone was close to Donnie's phone and followed the same route on the night of the crime. The detectives identified several key locations where Megan was supposedly abducted, where she was killed, and the field where her body was found. At all these locations, both phones were in proximity. Donnie's family owned several farms around Tullahoma. According to the investigation, after abducting her, Donnie took Megan to one of them, subjected her to violence, and killed her. The detectives obtained a search warrant and found a significant clue, a partially burnt bandana that turned out to belong to Megan. Her sister had given her that item. This evidence, combined with Megan's clothing and the DNA match, was enough to bring the case to trial. On November 5th, Donnie was charged with murder. At the trial, new details emerged that only strengthened the case against him. Reviewing his phone, experts discovered many interesting things. It turned out that Donnie had attempted several times to contact other women, offering them jobs as caregivers, but all those attempts failed. According to the investigation's version, Donnie found Megan's phone number on his wife's contact list. He contacted her, telling her that Naomi had recommended her as a caregiver. She agreed, and the man gave her a non-existent address, leading her to a remote location. There, he attacked her, took her to a farm, subjected her to violence, and killed her. Then he took her to a field and burned her. The final touch was the complete replacement of the carpets and seat covers of the pickup he used to transport her body. Apparently, the man feared that he could not completely eliminate certain blood traces and that the police would discover them. As for Naomi, the police concluded that she had no connection with the murder and knew nothing about it. That night, she was working, which was confirmed by numerous pieces of evidence. During the trial, Donnie declared his innocence, and everyone braced themselves for a potentially long process. However, when he realized that the prosecution would seek the death penalty, he decided to make a deal with the investigators. He agreed to forego the death sentence in exchange for a confession. As a result, he pleaded guilty to the murder of Megan and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nevertheless, after some time, he claimed that he had made the deal under pressure and demanded a review of the case. When the judge accepted his request, he quickly reverted to his previous decision to plead guilty, since a new review would again consider the death penalty. During the trial, it was also explained why the criminal, without any doubt, willingly provided detectives with his DNA sample. He apparently hoped that the fire would destroy all traces, so the police would simply have nothing to compare his sample to, but he was mistaken. With all this, investigators concluded that Donnie probably had no connection to the disappearance of another student who vanished 6 months before Megan. More suitable suspects emerged in that case, and Donnie's candidacy was no longer considered. After the announcement of the verdict, Megan's sister stated that the offender would continue preying on young women and could have taken many more lives, but Megan stopped him by becoming his victim. And ultimately, what makes this story even more tragic is that in November 2013, Megan's mother, who had been doing everything possible to help the police catch her daughter's killer, took her own life. She couldn't bear the devastating loss caused by a cold-hearted criminal. Looking at Donnie's background, it is clear that he could have been apprehended much earlier. Among his numerous offenses was the kidnapping of a young woman, but on that occasion he managed to avoid punishment, and the criminal remained at large. Who knows? Perhaps Megan was not his first victim, but the police have yet to confirm this. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Unreal True Crime. See you soon. Raheem Taylor, 58 years old, was the fifth execution of 2023, following a previous execution in Missouri, 2 in Texas, and 1 in Oklahoma. All were by lethal injection. Taylor kicked his feet as the 5 grams of pentobarbital were administered, then took 5 or 6 deep breaths before all movement stopped. In a final statement, Taylor said, "Muslims don't die, but live eternally in the hearts of our family and friends. Death is not your enemy. It is your destiny. Look forward to meeting it. Peace." Leonard Taylor was born in the United States in the mid-1960s. He was the son of Jesse, who also had another son identified as Perry Taylor. In the late 1980s, Leonard met a girl named Mia Perry, with whom he became romantically involved. Around this time, Leonard began to accumulate a criminal record. Initially, he was convicted on charges related to narcotics and concealed weapons in San Bernardino County and spent time behind bars, though the length of his sentence remains unclear. In September 1990, a 19-year-old man was fatally attacked following an argument in an apartment complex located in the same county. By then, Leonard, who had been released, was living in that area. Due to his criminal record, he became one of the primary suspects in the case, but managed to avoid any responsibility. As part of his scheme to evade justice, he used a false name, Michael Chambers. The following year, in 1991, Mia became pregnant. The news of his first child did not motivate Leonard to change his ways. During this time, He was arrested by the Drug Enforcement Administration and convicted for transporting and selling narcotics, leading to his incarceration in a federal prison. Since his daughter was born amid these circumstances, he was unable to be present with Mia during the birth. Facing reality, Mia named the baby on her own and prepared to raise her child independently. Soon after, what people thought became true. Leonard's connection seemed less likely with his newborn when, in 1992, he was found guilty of statutory rape and child abuse in San Diego County. While in prison, he disclosed to a local media outlet that he maintained connections with some scammers involved in irregularities related to corporate check frauds. Upon his release, Leonard embarked on a short-lived career in white-collar crime, which quickly returned him to jail, this time in the Missouri State Prison. The San Bernardino police arrested him again in 1999 for failing to register as a sex offender. Shortly after the beginning of the 2000s, Leonard was accused again, this time for intimate coercion against a minor. Aside from his illicit businesses, which required him to travel across the country, he maintained relationships and intimacy with multiple women simultaneously, earning him the nickname CAs, short for Casanova. Another standout trait of his criminal behavior was making and using fake IDs and different names, ending up with almost 20 of them at some unknown time. Leonard married a woman living in California who also had an outstanding arrest warrant for a probation violation. It was during this time, under unspecified circumstances, that Leonard met Angela Rowe. Their first encounter took place in the city of Jennings, in St. Louis County, Missouri. Angela was born around 1976. She had previously been in a romantic relationship with a man with whom she had other children, Alexis Conley, Acrea Conley, and Tyrese Conley. Despite being married and also being involved with another woman in Kentucky, Leonard began a relationship with Angela. After a rather brief period, he moved into her house located in the suburbs of St. Louis. Angela's home was well known among the neighbors for the constant joy radiated by her 3 young residents. From then on, Angela's house and her children also became the love nest for the new couple. By the end of 2004, Leonard and Angela had been living together for approximately a year, and according to her family and friends, their cohabitation was not without its challenges and difficulties. On Saturday, November 20th, 2004, a friend called Angela and asked to borrow $50. At that time of year, the traditional holiday season was approaching. Being a mother of 3 children, Christmas was particularly important. Therefore, Angela later took the time to decorate the house with her children, hanging large and striking candy canes at the entrance and placing lights to add to the festivity. That weekend, the kids went to celebrate Thanksgiving early with Tyrone, their father, and his side of the family. Meanwhile, on Sunday, November 21st, Angela did not show up for her weekend shift as a housekeeper, but called to inform she would not be able to come. The following day, a friend called her, and they chatted as usual. The children returned to their mother's house and were seen by some neighbors in the following days. From that weekend in November 2004, several significant events occurred, yet the how and when of the detailed events were something the authorities could never fully reconstruct. However, everything points to an argument between Leonard and Angela, during which she threatened him with a knife. He then overpowered her and shot her. In a turn of events, realizing that the kids had witnessed everything, Leonard took the lives of all 3 children. Afterwards, he turned off the heating and instead turned on the central air conditioning of the house. According to phone records, on November 23, 2004 at 11:24 p.m., Leonard called his brother Perry to ask for money. It is believed that during their conversation, he confessed to what had happened, adding that things had gotten out of control and that it wasn't what he wanted, but it happened. On the same day, Angela's friend called the house phone repeatedly without getting an answer. A few hours later, at 12:05 p.m. on Wednesday, November 24th, she tried again without success. Between that day and the next, Perry told his girlfriend about what Leonard had done. On Thursday, November 25th, while most American households were finalizing details to celebrate Thanksgiving, Perry went to his girlfriend's house. There, his brother contacted him again. After the conversation, Perry told the girl that Leonard was still in Angela's house, waiting for a letter from California. There were 3 more calls in the following hours, one of which was specifically made from the landline of Angela's house. It was during one of these conversations that Perry's girlfriend heard him ask Leonard how he was still there, specifically alluding to the presence of the bodies. What Leonard's response was remains unknown. Then, a plane ticket from St. Louis to California was booked, with the transaction being made from a phone number with a California area code. Early in the morning of Friday, November 26th, Leonard went to his sister-in-law's house so she could take him to the airport. He had plane tickets from St. Louis to Ontario, California, via Phoenix, Arizona. The ticket was in the name of Louis Bradley, an alias that Leonard used and for which he had a Missouri ID that included his photo. He took the opportunity of being at his sister-in-law's house to leave a box that was to be delivered to his brother. Shortly after, according to some witnesses, he was seen disposing of a gun in a sewer near Perry's girlfriend's house, but the weapon was never recovered. On the way to the airport, Leonard told his sister-in-law that this would probably be the last time she would see him alive. Then, to elaborate on this strange notion, he added that some people were trying to kill him and that she should not pay attention to things she might hear about him. Cameras recorded Leonard that Friday morning passing through the security area at St. Louis International Airport. He was wearing dark pants, a pink shirt, and a cream-colored hat, carrying 2 black bags. Shortly after, he headed to Gate 16 to catch the 8:10 Southwest Airlines flight to Ontario. Meanwhile, Angela's friend continued calling throughout those days until November 27th, never receiving a response. On the other side of the country, between Saturday and Sunday, Leonard finally met up with his wife. During this time, Angela's absence was noted by her co-workers, but unlike previous occasions, there was no call from her to report anything. Leonard stayed in San Bernardino County for 4 days before driving across the country with a friend. He traveled through Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia, ending up in a house in Kentucky. For the week of November 29th, when classes resumed after the Thanksgiving holiday, the absence of Angela's kids at school did not go unnoticed. Then, with considerable concern over Angela's prolonged silence, her family asked the police to check on the woman and her 3 children. Thus, on December 3, 2004, police officers were sent to the small brick house in the suburbs of St. Louis. Once on site, the officers found several significant details, including that the front door was locked, newspapers were piled up in the front yard, and mail overflowed the mailbox. The team managed to enter through a bedroom window. The air conditioning was running at full power outside while the television was on. The next thing the agents had to face was far from an idyllic home scene. Wrapped in blankets, Angela was found lifeless, likely from gunshot wounds. Her 3 young children also appeared to have suffered fatal gunshot wounds, and their bodies were aligned on a bed in the early stages of decomposition. The coroner found out that the victims had passed away 2 or 3 days before their bodies got stiff. Meanwhile, during subsequent thorough investigations at the residence, investigators found 2 non-functional cell phones, and there was no evidence that Angela had any other cell phone in use besides her own. As often happens in such cases, Leonard was immediately considered the main suspect. This was initially due to his relationship with Angela, but it is fair to say that his extensive criminal history also raised suspicions. As the police tracked his whereabouts, Perry was interrogated about the accusations against his brother on December 8, 2004. During that interview, Perry told detectives that Leonard had called him and admitted to his actions. After an intense nationwide chase, police monitored a house in Madisonville, Kentucky, where Leonard was staying. On December 9th, Leonard tried to flee by hiding on the floor of a vehicle and was arrested on the spot, holding a knife in his hand and moving under the alias of Jason. Beyond that, he made no moves nor uttered any comments. The sunglasses Leonard wore at the time of his arrest, along with a few other belongings, were taken as evidence, although nothing seemed to suggest that these objects could provide any clues. Later, the police made some statements about the arrest. According to the detective in charge, Leonard's wife was not much help in the investigation. Authorities believed Leonard had turned to her for money to facilitate his escape. While the only suspect was finally in custody, the funeral services for Angela and her kids were held in Missouri. Standing beside his oldest daughter's coffin, Tyrone could not help but break down. Leonard maintained his innocence throughout, and indeed, his defense focused on the fact that he was in California when the bodies were discovered. His case was also based on the probable date of death stated by the coroner. However, the suspicions for the 4 deaths were only part of his legal troubles. Thus, while awaiting the resolution of the case, in April 2005, Leonard began serving a 100-year sentence for an unrelated conviction. 5 months later, he filed a request for the state to notify him if there was any intention to use DNA evidence in the case involving Angela and her 3 children, and if so, what type it would be, and whether physical evidence had been presented for analysis or examination. On May 25, 2006, Leonard filed a motion requesting the return of his personal belongings, including the sunglasses he wore when arrested. But in August 2006, the state took possession of the glasses and other evidence that were in police custody, and 3 months later, in November, all items were taken to the forensic lab for analysis. There, experts conducted a specialized test, which is used to determine the possible presence of blood. The procedure yielded a positive result for the presence of blood on the nose pad of the sunglasses, but there was a complication since the sample was very small. For this reason, a second confirmation test to detect the presence of DNA was not performed. Between the end of that year and the beginning of 2007, the stain was subjected to DNA testing, but due to its size, the professional in charge could not obtain a complete genetic profile. What was obtained from the partial genetic profile excluded Angela's children. However, the presence of her DNA could not be ruled out from the study. Specifically, the result had a probability of matching 1 in every 12,300 people belonging to the African American population. In May 2007, Leonard filed a motion to exclude the results of these tests as evidence in the trial. A hearing was held where the state explained that the reports were disclosed as soon as they were received, and that, contrary to what Leonard suggested, the evidence was not deliberately hidden. Ultimately, the trial court rejected his request. In January 2008, Leonard again insisted on the same point by filing a new motion to exclude any evidence related to the specialized test. Another hearing took place, and the court overruled Leonard's objection, thus admitting the validity of the results as evidence of the presumed presence of blood. During the trial that year, Leonard objected to the admission of this evidence but again faced a setback when the trial court dismissed his objections. However, the forensic scientist who conducted the tests testified that the test is presumptive because it can also yield a positive reaction to substances like potatoes, rust, bleach, and nickel. He also emphasized that since there was no confirmatory examination, the substance on the glasses was only possibly blood. Leonard did not testify at his trial. However, the coroner did testify, and his testimony marked a significant turn in the case, as he stated that the deaths could have occurred 2 or 3 weeks before the officers visited the house. This detail firmly placed the incident before Leonard's departure to California. He also explained that he had not initially considered the detail that the air conditioning thermostat was set to the maximum cold setting. When the state called Perry as a witness, the case seemed to turn again, especially when asked about his statement during the police interrogation, where he said that Leonard had confessed to the acts. He said he did not remember anything that happened and went even further to claim that his statements to the police had been the result of coercion by the authorities. After hearing from the various witnesses, it was time for the closing arguments. The state, represented by the prosecution, emphasized that the blood sample found on the man's sunglasses was indeed Angela's. In this sense, it was recalled that scientific evidence does not need to be conclusive to be admissible. Indeed, while some states require it to be so, other states have held that presumptive blood tests are admissible as long as they are accurately described, achieving their purpose of being useful to the jury. After deliberating for 4.5 hours, the jury found Leonard Taylor guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of armed criminal action. But there is something particular about his sentencing. Although it has not been possible to determine when and how, it seems that during his time in prison, Leonard converted to Islam, even changing his name to Rahim. Thus, during the sentencing hearing, also known as the penalty phase, he prohibited his defense team from presenting witnesses. Instead, he stated he was Muslim and expressed to the judge that Allah, not the court, would determine his fate. The state presented evidence, including Leonard's previous convictions. Testimony was also offered from a victim who was forced by Leonard to have intimacy and 3 members of Angela's family. The jury found 5 aggravating factors for each victim, among them mental provocation, which made the acts considered outrageously vile, horrendous, and inhumane, thereby exhibiting cruelty and disdain for the sanctity of all human life. Consequently, Leonard was sentenced to capital punishment. The execution by lethal injection was scheduled for February 7, 2023, at a Missouri prison. The case attracted the attention of several groups dedicated to defending Leonard's innocence and, therefore, demanding a review and commutation of the sentence. However, the man's claims of innocence were rejected time and again. In response to some of the appeals, the Missouri Attorney General's office stated that the case against him was solid. Perry, Leonard's brother, died in 2015. In January 2023, as the execution date loomed, Leonard's attorneys requested a hearing on their client's claim of innocence. They were supported by a provision in Missouri law, which allows a prosecutor to file a motion for a hearing before a judge in case of new evidence of a wrongful conviction. Firstly, Leonard's defense team proposed a theory about an alternative perpetrator. After a drug deal went wrong, Leonard thought he would be targeted for murder, so he quickly left town. However, the traffickers showed up at Angela's house, and failing to find him or the illicit substances they believed were hidden there, they unleashed their fury on her and her 3 young children. Secondly, the defense team obtained statements from Leonard's daughter and from Mia, her mother. Both stated that he was in California at the end of November 2004, and according to the lawyers, he could not have been the perpetrator of the crimes. These documents were subsequently presented to the Conviction Review Unit within the prosecutor's office. The following month, just hours before the execution, St. Louis County prosecutor rejected the request for a hearing before a judge, stating that the facts did not support a credible case of innocence. Concurrently, the governor refused to grant a pardon, and the United States Supreme Court also declined to intervene. Finally, on Tuesday, February 7th, 2023, in the evening, everything was arranged to carry out the procedure. In his final statement, Leonard said that Muslims do not die, but live eternally in the hearts of family and friends. Taylor kicked his feet as the 5 grams of pentobarbital were administered, then took 5 or 6 deep breaths before all movement stopped. And that's the case for today. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. See you soon. On November 15th, 2013, Chris called 911. He said he had arrived home and found his parents unresponsive in their truck. Chris said that Roger was coughing and that Melissa's head was bobbing up and down. He said they were alive but barely moving. The dispatcher asked Chris to put them on their backs to try to administer CPR. Roger and Melissa had both been shot in the right side of their heads. Melissa Blumel died the next day, and Roger Blumel died about 5 weeks later. Roger Blumel was born on January 17, 1965, into a household bustling with many members, including his parents and 7 children, 6 boys and a girl. Roger's family was not only large but also very united, raised with a strong sense of values and community life. Even while still in high school, Roger proved to be a hard-working young man with goals for the future. He began driving his father's truck and, after graduating from the local high school, worked in concrete transportation. Later, he discovered that his true calling was in sales, a field in which he eventually found success. According to his friends, he was one of those people capable of selling ice to Eskimos. This skill was also accompanied by a generous, cheerful, and extroverted personality. He always seemed happy, and nothing pleased him more than making everyone around him have a big smile on their faces. Roger had a good life and an excellent relationship with his family. The only thing missing was a partner, and one day he achieved that too. The details are not specified, but a close friend later recounted that at the end of the evening, when he met a young woman who captivated him, Roger declared with absolute resolution that she was the woman he was going to marry. The girl in question was named Melissa. She was born in Wichita on January 1st, 1960. Her childhood, too, was spent in a loving family comprised of 3 girls and 3 boys, though a younger sister died before reaching her first birthday. Melissa was a sweet, hard-working girl, always ready to help not just her family but everyone around her. She began working as a cashier at a bank where she made a successful career. In the following years, her seriousness, commitment, and sense of collaboration earned her several promotions that led her to become the vice president of the bank. That first meeting marked the beginning of the union of 2 soulmates who married in 1991. Life for the Blumels seemed perfect as Melissa climbed the ranks within the bank, and Roger's charm led him to establish his own business. Roger loved to share time with friends and bring joy to everyone around him. In Melissa, he found the perfect companion. Moreover, both had a strong social consciousness that led them to collaborate and participate in any charitable, sports, or collective activity that took place in their community. However, as we've seen in almost all stories, a perfect life does not exist, and for the Blumels, The only thing missing was a child to bring laughter and joy to their loving home. Unfortunately, this desire remained elusive for the couple, and after years of unsuccessfully trying to conceive, Roger and Melissa began to consider the idea of adopting a child. With this intention, they contacted a local social worker. Their wishes were heard, and doubly so, as a woman named Keisha Schaberg had put up her 2 sons for adoption. Anthony, 7 years old, whom everyone called Tony, and Christopher, 4 years old, known as Chris. Keisha's idea was to place them in an open adoption so she could maintain contact with her sons and the family raising them. However, the Blumels did not consider this the best option, as they wanted to raise the children as their own and completely remove them from what had been a tough start in life. In the end, Roger and Melissa's approach prevailed, and from that moment, Tony and Chris formally became part of the Blumel family, starting to enjoy a life they never knew existed. In fact, it was later known that Tony was amazed he was allowed to have dinner every day. The children quickly adapted and began to enjoy their new life. They attended elementary school and successfully completed that stage as good students. In high school, they were also successful, had no problems with their peers, were fully integrated and made a wide group of friends, and excelled in sports, particularly in wrestling and football. Tony made rapid progress in wrestling, securing second place in a competition in his division. At that time, everything seemed to promise a bright future for the boys and a happy life for the whole family. But the Blumels' world began to turn upside down when Tony reached his senior year of high school. The young man began to change what had until then been exemplary behavior. He turned into someone who was constantly in conflict with his parents, accusing them of always favoring his younger brother Chris. From then on, he engaged in alcohol consumption, disregarded curfews, and even smoked marijuana. Things in the Blumel household became chaotic, and soon it seemed that the last hope for the young man to correct his path was lost. For a long time, Tony had expressed a fervent desire to join the United States Air Force after finishing high school. But this dream dissipated due to his own behavior when, in 2013, he was arrested for an unspecified act of aggression, and shortly after graduating, again for driving under the influence of alcohol. With these records, he could say goodbye to a future in military aviation. These events did not lead Tony to reflect. On the contrary, it plunged him into a downward spiral. Once he graduated from high school, his life had no direction. He did not want to continue studying, nor did he want to work. In fact, he wanted to do nothing more than sleep late and spend the rest of his day immersed in a cloud of cannabis smoke. Melissa lived in terror of the boy's outbursts of rage. And amidst all this situation, which was so difficult to bear, there was something else that the Blumels did not know. Since the spring of 2013, through social media, Keisha had been contacting her biological sons. While it seems Chris either rejected Keisha's friend request or was not very receptive to communicating with his biological mother, Tony not only accepted immediately, but was also completely excited to reconnect with his real mother. Keisha had been devastated after giving her sons to the Blumels. Although she was relieved to know that both had been welcomed into the same good family and would stay together, she could not resign herself to the lack of contact. Reconnecting with her eldest son filled Keisha with excitement, but at the same time she developed a great resentment towards the Blumels, believing that they had turned Chris against her. However, this feeling was undoubtedly overshadowed by the happiness of reconnecting with her firstborn. Additionally, the news of Tony's problems with his adoptive parents fueled Keisha's hope of reuniting with her son, and she wasted no time in offering him to come to see her. Meanwhile, at the adoptive family's home, far from improving, things were getting worse. The conflict reached a point of no return when one day, In the midst of one of his fits of rage, Tony punched a hole in a wall. This was the turning point for the Bloomels. They could no longer risk their own safety and that of Chris. After several unsuccessful discussions trying to put an end to the eldest son's behaviors, Roger and Melissa came to the difficult decision to tell Tony that he had to leave the house. The young man initially wandered aimlessly but soon realized he had to do something to sustain himself, so he got some jobs at fast food restaurants and supplemented those meager earnings by selling cannabis. Although he slept like a nomad from night to night at some friends' houses, he ended up associating with a group of youths who were deeply involved in excessive drug use. And amid all these despairing events, a lifeline suddenly appeared for Tony when Keisha told him to come to California to live with her. Tony eagerly accepted the invitation, and the reunion took place in September 2013 at Keisha's house in California. The young man was accompanied by his best friend from high school, Braden, who had dropped out in his junior year to dedicate himself to drug dealing. The two young men were excited because they arrived with the hope of having Keisha's support, who was also versed in the drug trade, to start a large marijuana business in the area, and they even talked about entering the medical cannabis market. The reality was that the two young men had arrived to live in a small apartment which had only one room. It is not hard to imagine that the situation in the place began to be tense, particularly because Sean, Keisha's partner, had 2 jobs and was the only one bringing in money to cover the expenses for 5 people. Keisha only contributed a part of the social assistance she received for her daughter. Keisha, Tony, and Braden spent their days using drugs, and the woman's younger daughter was all the time under that bad influence. Logically, at one point things reached an unacceptable limit, something that happened when Sean found out that Tony and Braden were selling marijuana near her house. She let them know that what they were doing was simply unacceptable and dangerous for her as the property owner. Consequently, she told them to take their drugs elsewhere. Additionally, after this episode, Sean gave an ultimatum to the house occupants. Everyone had to get a job or leave the apartment. Far from making the group reflect, as was her intention, what it achieved was that they formed an alliance to show indignation towards her. They decided to leave the apartment and go to a nearby hotel for 2 weeks. But that was not the solution either, because without having an income, after those weeks they had no means to sustain the hotel payment. The need for money did not make them consider working decently. The first idea they had was to return to Kansas, perhaps because it was familiar territory for Tony in terms of drug dealing. After almost a day on the road, the group decided to stop in Arizona and spend the night at a hotel. It was there that Tony told his travel companions that he had come up with an idea, which was to end the lives of his adoptive parents to claim the inheritance. Once they arrived in Wichita and found accommodation at a hotel they rented for a month, they dedicated themselves to refining the details of that idea. It was a simple solution. They had to end the lives of Roger and Melissa, claim the insurance, sell the assets, and use the resources to start a new, larger-scale drug business. Tony was convinced that the original family, which he had returned to, would become rich by cultivating and selling marijuana. Tony even proposed a perfect day to carry out the crime. It would be Friday, November 15th of that year, 2013, as his brother Chris would not be at home, as he had to attend an event related to his wrestling practice. Tony had been a star in that discipline and still maintained contact with some team members, which is how he learned about his brother's commitment that night. Gradually, the plan was formed, in which Tony would communicate with Roger and Melissa and invite them somewhere with the excuse of talking about what had happened between them and try to fix things. Tony's idea was that, while there was no one at home, Braden would take Keisha to the residence so she could enter and steal some valuables. Tony also knew where his adoptive parents kept a significant amount of money for emergencies. The idea was that the act would appear to be a robbery gone wrong. But from the beginning, the final intention was clear. When Roger and Melissa returned home, Keisha would end their lives. Everyone thought it was an excellent plan, but later, Braden backed out. He did not want to participate in the act, but agreed to help by acquiring the guns they would need. As a substitute, he recommended a friend of his, also a former high school peer named Andrew, who could take on the role as the driver to take Keisha to the Blumels' residence. As promised, Braden procured 2 pistols purchased from other criminals. It should be mentioned that there was never any intention to share the money with Andrew, who was agreed to be paid $1,000 to act essentially as a driver and support for Keisha in the robbery. In the end, she would be the executor. In early November, Keisha posted on her social networks a photo of her with Tony and a caption that read, "A bond that cannot be broken." Finally, the day arrived. It was Friday, November 15th, 2013, and as Tony had predicted, his wonderful adoptive parents did not refuse to meet with him. The meeting went peacefully. While at the Blumels' house, the scene was completely different. As soon as Roger and Melissa left for the meeting, Keisha and Andrew entered the house, forced the garage door, and began to rummage through everything. They took the opportunity to take some small, valuable items and the cash the couple kept in the house for any eventuality. Once the first part of the plan was carried out, Keisha and Andrew hid beside the secluded residence to wait for their victims to arrive. They soon received a call from Tony, informing them that the meeting had ended, that his adoptive parents had dropped him off at the hotel, and they were on their way home. The wait was not too long. As soon as the Blumels' vehicle stopped in front of the parking gate, the 2 attackers came out of their hiding place. Keisha immediately positioned herself on Melissa's side, while Andrew aimed at Roger to keep him still. Melissa, still surprised, recognized the mother of the children they had adopted more than 10 years ago to provide love, stability, and a better future. She only managed to say, "Oh my God, Keisha," when a precise shot to the head made her collapse in the seat. Roger, completely disconcerted, tried to assist his wife. Meanwhile, Keisha reached the man's window and pulled the trigger towards Roger's head, but the gun jammed. The woman made several attempts to shoot while he was frozen, with the slumped body of his wife next to him. Finally, the gun fired, and Roger also collapsed next to the one who had been the best partner for his life project. Once the fatal plan was carried out, Keisha and Andrew boarded the vehicle they had arrived in and quickly left. The Blumel spouses remained there until around 9:15 p.m., when Chris returned from his meeting and found the terrible scene. He immediately called 911, reporting that he had just arrived home and found his parents practically unconscious inside their van. The young man stated that Roger was coughing and that Melissa was bobbing her head up and down. Both had gunshot marks on their heads. The dispatcher instructed him to try resuscitation maneuvers while emergency services arrived a few minutes later and took over the situation. Miraculously, the Blumels were still alive, but their lives were hanging by a thread, so they were immediately transported to a hospital. While all this was happening, upon returning to the hotel where they were staying, Keisha seemed to have a panic attack and stated that all she needed was to consume some illicit substance, and she did so accompanied by the other boys. Also, at that moment, Keisha handed over the used gun and a wallet of Melissa's that she had stolen from the house to be disposed of in a nearby stream. Andrew threw the items into the pond of a nearby park. The following day, Tony began using the money stolen from his adoptive parents' home to start trafficking marijuana, earning his first $100. Unfortunately, that same day, Melissa lost her battle and passed away at the age of 53. Tony also went to the hospital to see his father, but what he did not know is that sometime before, he had been removed from both the Blumels' will and their insurance policies. Consequently, the two heinous crimes had been committed in vain. In the following days, it was also discovered that Andrew had not been paid and was even unaware that Keisha had taken cash from the Blumel family's home. Eventually, fate caught up with them. In the initial inspections of the Blumel residence, the police noticed that the garage door had been forced open, and inside the home everything was in disarray. There were items scattered everywhere. It was confirmed that money, jewelry, and other items had been stolen. The authorities wondered if the attack on the spouses had been a result of them arriving while the thieves were still in the house. However, the fatal assault had occurred before the couple entered the home, so this initial hypothesis was dismissed. In the van where Roger and Melissa were attacked, there were no significant fingerprints, although investigators did find a bullet casing. Then, the authorities turned their attention towards the victims' workplaces, thinking perhaps an upset client had sought revenge. But this theory was also discarded, so it was time to talk to people close to the couple. The first on the detectives' list was Tony, as he had been the last person seen alive with the victims. But the young man insisted he knew nothing and had not participated in the act. According to him, after finishing dinner, he had gone straight back to the hotel where he was staying with his mother. This information was confirmed by the staff at the tolls. The second on the list was Chris, who had found the bodies, but he was quickly dismissed after verifying his statement that, at the time of the incident, he was at a dinner with members of the wrestling team. However, the investigators found something strange in the young man's behavior. He didn't seem overly disturbed and instead appeared to be lost in thought. When the police pursued this direction and asked him what he thought had happened to his parents, Chris immediately replied that there was only one person who came to mind. He added that the only one who might hold any grudge against their parents, and perhaps be capable of such an act, was his older brother, Tony. With this significant lead, the authorities got a lucky break in their search for the culprits. A man contacted the police to say that a young man who was a friend of Tony had approached him intending to buy a gun. The detectives focused on this individual, and upon checking his background found he had a long history related to drugs. Moreover, they discovered he had traveled to California along with Tony. It was Braden. Sooner rather than later, Braden received a message from his family informing him that the sheriff's office investigators were looking to interrogate him about what had happened to the Blumels. The morning after receiving this information, Braden went to the police station. A press report states that on his way to the police station, he stopped by a pond to throw away something, apparently the guns used in the crime, which had not been disposed of as planned. According to this account, he was already under surveillance, and when the police searched the water, they found in the bag he threw a pistol that had not been fired in the attack. Braden's interrogation lasted for 3 days. At first, the young man maintained he had nothing to do with the incident, but he couldn't withstand the pressure from the authorities and ended up confessing everything he knew, stating that the idea for the attack had been Tony's. Tony Blumel, 18 years old, and his biological mother, Keisha, 35, were arrested on November 19th at the hotel where they were staying. Additionally, Andrew, then 18 years old, was arrested. And finally, Braden, also 18, was put behind bars on November 20th of that same year, 2013. At that time, Keisha did not admit her participation in the robbery and other crimes, although the 3 young men confessed what had happened. On November 25, 2013, the accused made their first appearance before the court via video conference. On that occasion, they were all charged with the same offenses: first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated robbery, burglary, and theft. The 3 young men were set a bail of $500,000, and for Keisha, the bail was set at $1 million. On December 21st, Roger's heart stopped beating, and at 48 years old, he joined his beloved Melissa. And after Roger's death, the situation for the woman and the 3 young men worsened, as they could be charged with capital murder, which could imply a death penalty sentence. Indeed, on January 3, 2014, the 4 detainees were formally charged with a count of capital murder for being the alleged perpetrators of the death of more than 1 person in the same incident. Additionally, Keisha was charged with 2 counts of aggravated robbery, 1 count of burglary, and 1 count of theft. The preliminary hearing took place on July 17th of that same year. By that time, Braden had negotiated with the authorities, and in exchange for a benefit in his sentence, he ended up becoming the prosecution's star witness. After a year of negotiations, not only did Braden reach an agreement, but 2 other individuals involved in the crime also negotiated with the prosecution. According to the agreements reached, the accused would not dispute the charges against them and would waive their right to appeal their sentences. In exchange, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty and to drop some charges. Starting in mid-2015, in separate hearings, each confirmed their decision to plead guilty. The judge sentenced Keisha to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the capital murder charge, and additionally to 122 months in prison for 2 counts of aggravated robbery. The sentences would be served consecutively. In her opportunity to speak, she stated she deeply regretted what had happened and lamented everything the Blumel family had to go through. The rest of her statement was controversial, as she claimed she had nothing to do with the incident, having no anger towards the Blumels. On the contrary, she had the utmost respect for them, as they had given Tony and Chris a wonderful life, and she would always be grateful for that. According to official records to this day, Keisha remains detained in a high-security-level correctional facility. The second to face his fate was her son, Anthony Blumel, known to everyone as Tony, who received the same sentence as his mother. During the sentencing hearing, Tony, who declined to speak when given the opportunity, heard the victim impact statement made by his aunt, Christina Blumel, who thanked the authorities for administering justice and referred to all the love that Roger and Melissa had given the boy. In complete silence, Tony listened to Christina's heartfelt words, and at one moment, tears almost sprang from the young criminal's eyes. In the end, the woman told Tony that he had chosen his path without anyone forcing him to make those decisions. She added that perhaps one day he might understand his choices, or perhaps he never would. Tony has been since then in a correctional facility. His record up to this moment listed a significant number of prison infractions related to smuggling, fights, unauthorized phone use, explicit sex, theft, and disobedience, among others. A week after these sentences, it was Andrew's turn, the only one who did not agree to acknowledge his responsibility and was found guilty of first and second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, plus 155 months. Finally, Braden, the last of the participants in the incident and who from the beginning had reached an agreement with the prosecution, was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 24.5 years in prison. According to his official record, his first opportunity for release will be on May 28, 2035. However, his prison record shows that far from reforming, Braden had received 71 disciplinary reports for disobedience, threats to others, stimulant use, intoxication, possession of tobacco contraband, theft, and dangerous smuggling, among other causes. In the end, the district attorney expressed satisfaction with the outcome of this case. It's worth noting that even though she had waived that right, Keisha attempted to appeal her sentences unsuccessfully. At the end of this story, only one thing remains undisputed. The lives of two wonderful people, Roger and Melissa Blumel, were cut short with a terrible and unnecessary ending. The bitterness, or perhaps the guilt of a woman who led a life of excess for which she gave up her children for adoption, was the genesis of the tragedy. She couldn't bear that one of her descendants wanted nothing more to do with her, which apparently led her to direct her anger at the people who gave all their love and well-being to her children. For his part, Tony repaid all the love and care received from that couple with resentment, envy, and violence, resorting to an unjustifiable path of substance abuse, and finally, a double crime. Keisha's younger daughter ended up being sent to a foster home. As for Chris Blumel, he managed to overcome what happened and has led a good life with the support of the family. And well, dear audience, that concludes today's case. Before you go, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to share this video if you think someone you know might be interested. See you in another episode of Unreal True Crime. Goodbye.